Good morning. Our first reading this morning is from 2 Kings 2, verses 1 to 12. Now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has now sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But again he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they were both standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water. The water was parted to one side and to the other, until the two of them crossed on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha said, "Please, let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continued walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended into a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. This is the word of the Lord. The psalm this morning is Psalm 50. Please read responsively with me. The Mighty One, God the Lord, has spoken, calling the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, perfect in his beauty, God shines forth in glory. Our God will come and will not keep silence, with a consuming flame before, the round about a raging storm.
God calls the heavens and the earth from above to witness the judgment of people.
Gather before me, my loyal followers, those who have made a covenant with me and sealed it with sacrifice.
The heavens declare the righteousness of God's cause, for it is God who is judge.
The New Testament reading this morning is 2 Corinthians 4, verses 3 to 6. "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves, we proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." This is the word of the Lord. Thank you.
The gospel reading this morning is from Mark chapter 9, beginning at verse 2. Jesus has just been at Caesarea Philippi, and Peter has made his confession of Christ. And then our reading begins. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared with them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Last week I quoted the verse from Proverbs 29 verse 18, "Without a vision the people perish." Proverbs 29:18, "Without a vision the people perish." And I spoke of St. Andrew's and how we need a vision of what God has called us to do here, and how as individuals we need a vision of what God wants to do in our lives. Well, here in today's passage we see Peter, James and John have the ultimate vision of Jesus. A vision of the transfiguration, as we call it. In Greek, the word is metamorpho, which means changing. It's where we get our word metamorphosis from. And it's quite strange that the Greek word metamorphosis is more well known or understood to us than the word transfigured, which the translators used to try and make it more clear at the time. What does transfigured mean? Well, I'm sure the gospel writers had equal difficulty in really writing down what they had seen. How can you say what transfigured mean? Changed. But in some way, Jesus was changed before them. He wasn't just an ordinary man standing amongst them. Some of the prophecies from Isaiah say he was nothing to look at. He was an ordinary man, nothing special to behold. And yet at this moment, suddenly they saw that he was something more to behold. As I said in the introduction to our gospel reading, this happened 6 days after Peter confessed who Jesus was at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus asked them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they said, "Well, some say that you're the prophet, some say that you're Elijah come back from the dead." And then he said to Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter confessed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But clearly Peter still really hadn't quite understood who Jesus was, because immediately later Jesus starts to share about his need to go to the cross, and then Peter says, "Forbid it, Lord, it must never happen." And Jesus has to say to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan." So Peter really still hadn't quite grasped who Jesus was. And then 6 days later, there's this amazing transfiguration when Jesus is up on the mountain and suddenly becomes shining like the sun, shining in white clothes, brighter than any bleach could possibly make anything to shine. And there with him is Moses and Elijah. Moses, we think, representing the prophet, representing the law and the Pentateuch, and Elijah representing the prophets, and together representing God's dealing with man in the past, but both of them with Jesus. Most of us come from a Protestant background. I come from a Methodist background, as you know. This church was built by the Church of Scotland, which is of the Presbyterian foundation. And we don't go much in for visions, and certainly not for images, for idols, for stained glass is not that common. If this was a Coptic church, then above the arch we would have Jesus in the center and the apostles on either side and the gospel writers below those. If it was a Catholic church, most likely we would have a big crucifix hanging in the center showing us Jesus on the cross. We don't have many pictures of Jesus. If we look around the church, the only image really we have is the cross at the center of our altar. Very little else which visually shows any representative at all. And even that isn't a picture of a person, but just the cross to remind us that Jesus died for us. But I think sometimes we do need to have a vision, and sometimes it helps if we have a visual image of who Jesus is. Peter, James, and John knew Jesus face to face, and yet when they had this vision of Jesus' presence, of who he was, in an amazing way, it affected their lives. We are going through difficult times in this country at the moment. Things are very uncertain. And yet, if we have a vision of Jesus, then that can be the thing which gives us the strength to continue onwards, the strength to carry on. Haley, if you can just put the picture, just touch the space bar. This just is a vision. Oops. That might come back in a minute. This is just showing a vision, a picture of Jesus. A picture of Jesus looking over the place of Cairo. It's coming back, I think. There we go. A picture of Jesus with his arms outstretched over Cairo. You can see the TV building and all the different buildings around below it. And St. Andrew's will be somewhere on the far right. Jesus reaching his arms across the city. Now, of course, we don't see that as we look out at the sky. And yet we can remember that that is the truth, that we need a vision in our hearts that Jesus does have his arms stretched out over the city, over the land, over the nation. That Jesus is the one who wept over Jerusalem as he was going into Jerusalem because he knew what was going to befall that city. And we can know now that Jesus is the one who's reaching out over Egypt, over Cairo, for all the things which are happening. Isaiah had a vision of God when he was in the temple, and that caused him to realize how unclean he was, that he needed to be purified because of his uncleanliness in the presence of God. We can have a vision of Jesus with us. And sometimes when we're going through the hardest times, that's when we most need the vision. Sometimes I find it very helpful just to imagine that Jesus is walking beside me and even hold out my hand and imagine that I'm holding hands with Jesus when things are very tough. Because sometimes it helps us to have a physical image in our mind that Jesus, that God is with us. What is the solution to Egypt's problems at the moment? Well, we can give the full answer that Jesus is the answer. That if people know Jesus, then our lives, their lives, all lives can be transformed. One of the questions which we often hear answered or questioned is, what would Jesus do? That's one of those Christian phrases, what would Jesus do? And yet, I think a better question is, what is Jesus doing? Because it's not a question of what would Jesus do if he were here. Jesus is here. It's a question of what is Jesus doing? It's a question of this is what Jesus is doing. That Jesus, we know, is intercessing at the right hand of the Father. He prays for us, he cares for us. That Jesus is caring, loving, watching over all the people of Cairo, all the people of Egypt. He is the one who is healing. He is the one who brings reconciliation. He is the one who is with us. Colossians 1:15, verses 15 to 17, talks about Jesus. Paul writes, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Jesus is not just somebody who was a great teacher, although he was that. He isn't just somebody who came 2,000 years ago to show us a good example of how to live our lives, although he is that too. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the one who is all-powerful, the ultimate authority. The ultimate authority in Egypt isn't the government. The ultimate authority in America isn't the president. The ultimate authority in the world is God. Jesus shall reign where'er the sun doth his successive journeys run. His kingdom stretch from shore to shore, till moon shall wax and wane no more. Jesus is the one over all. Jesus, the name high over all, the name to sinners given. If we can renew our vision of Jesus, this can give us strength to move forward. It's not just to do with logic. It's not just to do with knowledge in our head. It's to do with having that relationship. And a relationship leads to love, to trust, to hope, to excitement, if it's a true relationship. I pray that as we go forward in this week, we ask God to give us a renewed vision of who Jesus is. Peter, James, and John saw Jesus transfigured up on the mountain. We can't really quite understand what that means. But yet, if we have a vision of who God is, of who Jesus is, then we know it's not a question of what would Jesus do if he was here, but what is Jesus doing now, and how we can worship him and give him thanks for all he is doing in our lives and in the world. The Lord is here. His Spirit is with us. Amen.